Arthur Vance had placed the advertisement with hands that felt clumsy and foreign holding a pen. He had described his ranch in Redemption Creek, Nevada, not with pride, but with the stark honesty of a man listing assets at a bankruptcy sale. 160 acres of deeded land under the Homestead Act, a modest but sound 4-room house, a spring-fed creek that ran dry most Augusts, and a herd of 50 longhorns that were more bone and temperament than beef. He had described himself just as plainly. 34 years old, a widower for 3 years, in possession of his health and all his teeth, seeking a wife to share the burden and the quiet. He expected someone like his late Martha, small, pious, with hands made for kneading dough and mending shirts, not for wielding anything heavier than a cast-iron skillet. The telegraph from Sacramento had confirmed her arrival on the Tuesday train. Miss Eleanor Vance. A good, solid name. He had read the letters she'd written in a delicate looping script, full of hope and scripture. Therefore, when the Union Pacific engine hissed to a stop, belching steam and cinders into the shimmering summer heat of 1878, Arthur scanned the disembarking passengers for a woman in a simple calico dress, perhaps clutching a worn Bible. But what he found standing on the platform was not what he had imagined. She was the last one off the passenger car, and she stood apart from the others as if the dusty ground around her was her own sovereign territory. She was Chinese, which was the first shock. The second was her attire. She wore a man's black duster, black trousers, and scuffed black boots. On her head sat a black, flat-brimmed cowboy hat, its crown low and severe. A single dark brown suitcase stood by her side. She was not small. She was tall for a woman, lean and straight-backed, and she moved with a deliberate economy that wasted no energy. Her face was calm, her eyes dark and watchful as they swept over the small crowd, dismissing each face until they landed on him. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him despite the heat, that she was looking for him. She walked toward him, her boot heels making a soft rhythmic sound on the wooden planks. The station master, a portly man named Henderson, stared openly. A few loiterers by the freight office stopped talking. Arthur felt a flush of heat crawl up his neck that had nothing to do with the sun. "You are Arthur Vance?" she asked. Her voice was low and clear, her English precise, with an accent he couldn't place. It held no trace of the gentle deference he'd read in the letters. He could only nod, his tongue suddenly thick in his mouth. "You're Miss Vance?" The name felt absurd on his lips. "I am the one who answered the advertisement," she said, which was not the same as answering his question. She looked past him toward his wagon parked at the edge of the street. "Is that yours?" "It is," he managed. "We have a long ride ahead." She gave a single sharp nod. "Good. The air in this town is stale." Without another word, she picked up her suitcase and walked toward the wagon, leaving Arthur standing on the platform like a fence post. He watched her go, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and dawning panic. This was not the woman from the letters. This was not a partner for the quiet life. The way she walked, the way she wore the gun belt strapped low on her hips, the way her eyes never seemed to blink. It all spoke of a life far removed from Scripture and kneading dough. He had sent for a wife to build a home, but he had the sinking feeling that what the railroad had delivered was trouble, wrapped in black cloth and carrying a single brown suitcase. What he did not yet know was that the trouble she carried was not just her own, and it was about to spill over onto his 160 acres of hard-won Nevada land. The ride back to the ranch was a study in silence. The squeak of the wagon wheels and the plodding of the 2 old mules were the only sounds between them. Arthur tried to ask questions, but his attempts were met with short, clipped answers that offered nothing. Where was she from? The East. Had the journey been difficult? It is over. Her name? She paused for a long moment, her eyes on the horizon. You may call me May, she finally said. It was a name, but it felt like a wall. His ranch was nestled in a small valley, a lonely collection of buildings dwarfed by the vast, unforgiving landscape. The house was simple, built of clapboard and hope. A barn, a corral, and a chicken coop completed the picture. It wasn't much, but it was his. As they pulled up, his dog, a scruffy mutt named Buck, came bounding out, barking furiously at the stranger. May didn't flinch. She stepped down from the wagon before Arthur could offer a hand and stood perfectly still. Buck skidded to a halt a few feet away, the barks turning into a low growl. May held out a hand, palm down. She made no sound. The dog took a hesitant step forward, sniffed her fingers, and then, to Arthur's astonishment, whined softly and nudged his head against her leg. May looked at Arthur. He is a good judge of character. You are fortunate. Inside, the house felt small and cluttered. Martha's presence still lingered in the faded floral curtains and the neatly arranged tins on the kitchen shelf. Arthur felt a fresh pang of awkwardness. There are 2 bedrooms, he said, his voice too loud in the quiet space. You can take the one at the back. It's smaller. She walked through the main room, her eyes taking in every detail. She ran a finger along a dusty windowsill, then looked at her clean fingertip. She wasn't judging, she was assessing. This will do, she said, and carried her suitcase into the back room, closing the door behind her. Arthur stood in the middle of his own home, feeling like an intruder. He had wanted to fill the silence Martha had left behind, but this new silence was different. It was heavier, charged with unspoken things. He went outside and began the evening chores, his movements mechanical. He fed the mules, milked the lone cow, and scattered grain for the chickens. The familiar rhythm failed to soothe him. Every so often he would glance at the house, at the closed door of the back bedroom. He had made a terrible mistake. He would have to send her back on the next train. He had barely enough money for the ticket, but the cost to his reputation would be worse. The whole town had seen him meet her. They would talk. He was so lost in his worries that he didn't hear her approach. He turned from the corral fence and she was there, no more than 10 feet away. She had removed the duster, revealing a simple gray shirt, but the gun belt remained. The fence on the north pasture is weak, she said, her voice cutting through the evening air. A determined steer could walk right through it. He blinked. How do you know that? I walked the property line while you were working. He stared at her. She had been here less than 2 hours and had already assessed his greatest vulnerability. The north pasture bordered the vast holdings of Marcus Fletcher, a man who believed all land, deeded or not, was his for the taking if it wasn't properly defended. I know it's weak, Arthur said, a defensive edge to his voice. I ain't had the time or the money for new posts. Fletcher's cattle have been grazing on your land, she stated. It wasn't a question. I saw the tracks. 3 head, maybe 4. They came through the gap and went back. This was a sore point Arthur had tried to ignore for months. Fletcher was a powerful man, with a 6 hired guns on his payroll. A direct confrontation was foolhardy. It's just a few strays, he mumbled. May's gaze was unwavering. A man who lets another man's cattle graze his land will soon find another man's brand on his own. The words stung because they were true. He felt his face flush with shame. He was about to retort when the sound of approaching horses made them both turn. 3 riders were coming up the lane. At their lead was Marcus Fletcher himself, a large man with a florid face and a smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. "Vance!" Fletcher called out, reining in his horse. His eyes flickered to May, a smirk playing on his lips. "I see you've acquired some new help." The way he said it was an insult. "This is my wife," Arthur said, the words tasting like ash. He had to establish her position immediately, for her safety if not for his pride. Fletcher's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. "Your wife? Well, I'll be. Didn't take you for a man with such exotic tastes." His men snickered. "I came about a small matter of a stray calf. One of my prize heifers dropped a calf last week, and it seems to have wandered off. My boys tracked it to your creek." Arthur knew this was a lie. It was a test, a way for Fletcher to assert his dominance. "I haven't seen any calf, Fletcher," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Is that so?" Fletcher swung down from his horse. "Well, I think my boys and I will just have a look around your barn, just to be sure." He started walking toward the barn, his men flanking him, their hands resting near their pistols. Arthur moved to block his path. It was a foolish, impulsive gesture, and he knew it. He was one man, unarmed, against three. "You're not welcome on my property, Fletcher." Fletcher laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Your property? This little patch of dust is only yours as long as I say it is." He shoved Arthur hard in the chest. Arthur stumbled back, tripping over a loose stone and landing hard in the dirt. Humiliation burned in his gut. He looked up to see one of Fletcher's men, a lanky youth with a cruel grin, draw his pistol. The man didn't point it at Arthur. He pointed it at the sky. "Let's see if we can't liven things up," the man drawled, preparing to fire and spook the animals in the corral. But the shot never came. There was a blur of motion, a sound like a whip crack, and the pistol flew from the man's hand, landing in the dust a dozen feet away. The man yelped, clutching his stinging fingers. Everyone froze. They turned to look at May. She stood where she had been, but now her right hand held a Colt Peacemaker, the barrel still smoking slightly. It seemed to have appeared from nowhere. "You will pick up your weapon," she said, her voice calm and dangerously quiet, "and you will leave his land." Fletcher stared at her, his smirk gone, replaced by a look of disbelief, then fury. "Who in the hell do you think you are?" "I am his wife," May said. The words held a different weight now. They were not a statement of domesticity, but a declaration of allegiance. "And this is our land. You are trespassing." The lanky man, his face pale, scrambled to retrieve his gun. Fletcher looked from May's steady hand to Arthur, who was now getting to his feet, a look of stunned awe on his face. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind whistling through the eaves of the barn. Fletcher was a bully, not a fool. He knew a standoff when he saw one, and he didn't like the look in the Chinese woman's eyes. There was no fear there, none at all. He spat on the ground. "This isn't over, Vance," he snarled, climbing back onto his horse. "You've made a powerful enemy today." He and his men rode off, kicking up a cloud of dust that hung in the evening air like a threat. Arthur watched them go, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned to May. She was already holstering her pistol, the movement fluid and practiced. She looked at the weak spot in the corral fence, then back at him. "We will need more fence posts," she said, as if nothing had happened. "We should start cutting them at first light." Arthur could only nod. The woman he thought was a mistake had just saved him from public humiliation and an unknown amount of theft. But her skill with a gun was not that of a homesteader's wife. It was the skill of someone who had faced men like Fletcher before. He realized Fletcher was right about one thing. This was not over. It was just the beginning. And the real danger might not be from Fletcher at all, but from the secrets the woman called May kept locked away behind her unblinking eyes. That night, an uneasy truce settled over the small house. Arthur cooked a meager meal of beans and bacon, and they ate in silence at the small kitchen table. The questions he wanted to ask felt too large and dangerous for the room. Who was she? Where did she learn to shoot like that? And why was she here, on his ranch, answering an ad meant for a simple, God-fearing woman? After the meal, she stood and took her plate to the washing basin. "I will clean," she said. "You should check on the animals. A predator will smell a coward's fear from a mile away." The barb hit its mark. He had been a coward, and they both knew it. He went outside, the cool night air a balm on his hot face. He checked the barn and the corral, his senses on high alert. When he returned, the kitchen was clean, the lamp turned down low. A pot of coffee was warming on the stove. May was sitting at the table, a whetstone and a long knife in her hands. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was the only sound. He poured himself a cup of coffee, his hands shaking slightly. He sat down opposite her. "We need to talk," he said. She did not look up from her work. "Words are cheap. We need fence posts." "Fletcher won't forget this," Arthur insisted. "He'll be back. What you did today, that's not something a man like him lets go." "Then we will be ready for him," she said simply. Frustration rose in him. "How? With what? I am one man. You are one woman. He has a dozen men who will do whatever he says." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Who are you, May? Really?" She finally stopped sharpening the blade and looked at him. In the dim lamplight, her face was a mask of shadows, but her eyes were clear. "I told you. I am the one who answered the advertisement." She reached into a pocket of her shirt and pulled out a small, worn bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. She slid them across the table. They were his letters, and the ones he had received. He recognized the delicate, looping script. "These are from Eleanor," he said, confused. "Yes." May's voice was softer now. "Eleanor was my friend. We grew up together in a mission in San Francisco. She was good and kind, like you imagined. She wanted a home, a place where she could be safe." May paused, her gaze distant. "She read your advertisement in the paper. She believed your words. She thought you were an honorable man." A cold feeling began to spread through Arthur's chest. "Was?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "She fell ill with a fever on the journey from California, in a small town in the mountains. The doctor did what he could." May looked down at her hands. "I buried her myself, under a pine tree. I read the scripture for her, the way she would have wanted." Arthur stared at the letters, the words of hope and faith now seeming like a cruel joke. "Then, why are you here? Why did you come in her place?" "Because the men she was running from were still looking for her," May said, her voice flat and hard. "And when they found out she was dead, they would start looking for me." "Who? Who is looking for you?" "A man in San Francisco, a powerful man named Quan. He runs the docks. He brings girls from our homeland and sells them. Eleanor and I were supposed to be sold. We escaped. Quan does not like to lose his property. He put a price on our heads. Not for the law, for men who do not ask questions." Suddenly, the gun, the black clothes, the watchfulness, it all made a terrible kind of sense. She wasn't an outlaw by choice. She was a survivor. "Eleanor believed this place, your ranch, was a refuge," May continued. "She thought a marriage contract would protect her. When she died, I took her ticket and her name. I thought perhaps I could find that refuge here too, a place to disappear." She looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face. but I see now I have only brought my trouble to your door." Arthur was speechless. The simple transaction he had initiated, a wife for a home, had become something impossibly complicated. This woman was a fugitive. Harboring her was a crime. Fletcher was a predictable danger, a snake in the grass. But this Quan, this faceless man from a city he'd never seen, was a ghost who could send killers after them. The sound of a horse approaching at a fast trot broke the silence. It wasn't the sound of Fletcher's men. This was a single rider, moving with purpose. Arthur stood, his heart hammering against his ribs, and went to the window. In the bright moonlight he could see a man on a tall bay horse. He wore the coat of a lawman, a U.S. Marshal's star glinting on his chest. May was beside him in an instant, her pistol once again in her hand. "Is it him?" she whispered. "It's a marshal," Arthur said, his mouth dry. The marshal reined in his horse and dismounted. He walked to the door and knocked, the sound loud and authoritative in the night. Arthur looked at May. Her face was pale, but her hand was steady. He saw the choice before him laid out as clear as day. He could open the door and hand her over. The marshal would likely have a warrant, a reward. It would solve his Fletcher problem, his money problem, all of it. He could go back to his quiet, lonely life. Or he could lie. He could stand between this woman and the world that was hunting her. It was a choice between safety and something else, something he couldn't yet name but felt in the pit of his stomach. It was the same feeling he'd had when he stood up to Fletcher, a feeling of being the man he was supposed to be. He looked at the door, then back at May. He gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He put a finger to his lips, then pointed to the back room. She understood. She slipped away into the shadows as he turned to face the door. He took a deep breath and opened it. The marshal was a tall, weathered man with tired eyes. "Arthur Vance?" he asked. "I am," Arthur said. The marshal held up a piece of paper. It was a wanted poster. On it was a crude sketch of a Chinese woman. It looked nothing like May, but the description was close enough. "I'm Marshal John Peterson. I'm tracking a fugitive. A Chinese woman, goes by the name of Li Hua. Wanted for questioning in a murder in San Francisco. Last seen heading east. We have reason to believe she may have passed through this territory. Have you seen anyone matching this description?" Arthur looked at the poster, then met the marshal's gaze. The lie felt heavy on his tongue, a physical weight. "No, Marshal," he said, his voice steadier than he expected. "No one like that around here, just me and my wife." The marshal's eyes narrowed slightly, peering past Arthur into the dim interior of the house. "Your wife? Didn't know you'd remarried." "Just arrived today," Arthur said, stepping out onto the porch to block the view. "From back east. She's tired from the journey, already turned in for the night." Peterson considered this for a moment. He looked around the quiet yard, at the dark windows of the house. He seemed to listen to the silence. "All right, Mr. Vance. Sorry to disturb you. If you do see or hear anything, you send a telegraph to the office in Carson City." "I'll do that, Marshal," Arthur said. The marshal nodded, turned, and walked back to his horse. Arthur stood on the porch, his body rigid, until the sound of the hoofbeats faded into the night. He closed the door and leaned against it, his knees weak with relief. May emerged from the back room, her face unreadable. She walked to the table and picked up the bundle of letters, holding them in her hand. "You lied for me," she said softly. "He was looking for a murderer named Li Hua," Arthur said, avoiding her eyes. "You are May. You are my wife." He said the words again, and this time they didn't taste like ash. They felt like a promise. She looked at him for a long time. "The man who was killed in San Francisco," she said, her voice barely audible. "He was one of Quan's men. He was trying to take Eleanor. I stopped him." The confession hung in the air between them. She was a killer defending her friend. The law wouldn't see the difference. Arthur finally understood the true weight of the choice he had just made. He had not just lied to a U.S. Marshal. He had sided with a fugitive, a woman who had killed to be free. He had stepped out of his own quiet life and into hers. "Get some sleep," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't define. "We have fence posts to cut in the morning." 3 months later, the autumn sun cast a golden light over the valley. The north pasture fence stood straight and strong, built of new-cut timber. The creek, which should have been dry, trickled steadily, fed by a new diversion ditch they had dug by hand from a higher spring. The cattle were fat and calm, and their number had grown by 10. A shrewd purchase May had negotiated at a livestock auction, her sharp eye spotting undervalued yearlings the other ranchers had missed. Marcus Fletcher still owned the neighboring land, but his power had diminished. After the marshal's visit, rumors had flown. Arthur Vance, the quiet widower, had a new wife, and she was not a woman to be trifled with. Fletcher had tried a few more tactics, a blocked road, a spooked herd, but each time he was met with a quiet, unyielding preparedness. His men grew wary of riding near the Vance property. There was no confrontation, just a simple, clear message. This land was protected. The community in Redemption Creek, which had first whispered with suspicion, now spoke with a grudging respect. They saw the new fence, the healthier cattle, the look of solid purpose on Arthur Vance's face. They saw a man whose fortune had turned. Arthur and May worked from sunup to sundown, a team bound by unspoken understanding. They rarely spoke of the past. The wanted poster and the name Li Hua were never mentioned again. Their language was one of shared labor, of passing a hammer without being asked, of knowing when the other was tired and needed to rest. In the evenings they would sit on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast, dark sky. The silence between them was no longer heavy or awkward. It was a comfortable quiet, full of things that no longer needed to be said. One evening, Arthur came into the house to find May sitting at the table, the old bundle of Eleanor's letters in front of her. She was not reading them. She was just looking at the faded ribbon. "She would have liked it here," May said, without looking up. "She would have planted a garden by the creek. She loved flowers." Arthur sat down across from her. He had kept her dark brown suitcase in the barn, a silent reminder of the day she arrived. But the black hat now hung on a peg by the door, right next to his own. It no longer looked like the uniform of a dangerous stranger. It looked like it belonged. "We could plant a garden next spring," he said. She finally looked up at him, and for the first time he saw something in her eyes other than watchfulness or sorrow. It was a hint of a smile, a small, fragile thing. "Yes," she said. "I think she would like that." He reached across the table, and his hand covered hers, his calloused fingers resting over her knuckles. Her hand was warm and strong. It was not the hand of the delicate woman from the letters, but it was the hand of the woman who had mended his fence, saved his ranch, and stood with him against the world. He had sent away for a wife to share the burden of a lonely life, and in the most unexpected way imaginable, his request had been answered. He had found a partner not for a quiet life, but for a life worth fighting for. And he knew, looking at her in the warm lamplight, that building a home had nothing to do with the soundness of the house or the deed to the land. It was about finding the one person willing to stand with you when the world tried to tear it all down. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.